On 7th July 1942, Heinrich Himmler, with Hitler's consent, authorized a series of medical experiments at Auschwitz, where the main victims were women. These prisoners were subjected to forced sterilizations, mutilations and tests with chemical substances by doctors such as Josef Mengele. Pregnant women were forced to abort or desperately tried to hide their pregnancies to avoid selection for the gas chambers. In the female barracks, life was a hell marked by hunger, abuse, and the constant threat of death. The Nazis created women-only camps such as Ravensbrück, where more than 100,000 prisoners suffered forced labor and medical experiments. Some, such as Heike Grossmann, led resistance fighters in the ghettos, while others, such as Ella Gartner and Rosa Rabota, participated in the destruction of a gas chamber at Auschwitz, demonstrating bravery in the face of horror. A monster advances on Europe, first abuses after the Blitzkrieg. As Nazism advanced across Europe, conquering new territories almost daily, high-ranking officers understood that it was necessary to set up not only military bases, but also brothels run by the Reich. These were establishments where German soldiers could have forced sexual relations with the women enslaved there. This morbid state policy had two clear purposes. On the one hand, it promoted the sexuality that Nazism considered normal, preventing soldiers from engaging in excessive masturbation or homosexuality. On the other hand, it attempted to maintain control of the women with whom soldiers fraternized, avoiding epidemics of sexually transmitted diseases that could dangerously reduce the number of men available to fight. Of course, the soldiers had no problem obeying the orders of their superiors. Military brothels were usually operated in old mansions, buildings, or even brothels that were run by SS officers. The structure was used to transport women from the region, or even girls from faraway countries there, who were kept as prisoners in these places. One of the most incredible examples occurred in the French city of Brest, where SS officers set up a brothel in a synagogue, a humiliation both for French women and for Judaism. Under the Star of David, the hours at which Hitler's soldiers could come to use the services of the place were read. It is worth clarifying that when we talk about services, we are actually referring simply to systematic violations by German troops. Machine translated by Google. The girls who lived in these military brothels did not do so voluntarily. The vast majority were victims of kidnappings or mass abductions in small towns. Officers would arrive, select the most attractive girls, mainly those who met the Aryan standards of beauty, and take them prisoner. In the daily life of a young Nazi, sex with women of Slavic race was totally forbidden since they were considered a lower caste. However, within the brothels, this type of relationship was permitted. The only thing that escaped the tolerance of the SS were Jewish and Gypsy women who were excluded and taken to concentration camps. Later we will tell you about the horrific role that many of them played there. These war crimes were not a secret. During the war, several invaded states in Europe issued official reports of mass abductions of women. The Polish government in exile did the same on May 3, 1941, stating that the SS were carrying out raids to take young Polish women to their dark, militarized brothels. The incredible thing is that, on paper, Nazism considered prostitution to be a social disease that degenerated the minds of young people, but it seems that this moral rule did not apply in times of war. Even the officers of the Third Reich did not stay away from this practice. Life in Nazi brothels was a true hell on earth, with inhumane health conditions. In the old, destroyed buildings, several girls lived, sleeping and receiving their rapists in the same bed. There was no change of clothes or nutritious food, only the basic conditions for the slaves to be attractive enough for the German troops. A frequent problem was sexual diseases, including syphilis and gonorrhea. If a girl was diagnosed with these diseases, she was treated in a very rudimentary and disinterested way. There would always be a prisoner to replace her. If the girl did not improve soon, her fate was the firing squad and an unmarked grave. As we mentioned earlier, the military management of brothels also sought to quell epidemics of these diseases, which could put a soldier out of action for a long time. It was precisely for this reason that the British spy Virginia Hall organized a series of clandestine brothels where women knowingly infected soldiers. Historically, sex and prostitution have been a fundamental part of war. For the German soldiers occupying France, the summer of 1940 felt like one long vacation, during which they had the opportunity to occupy the enemy's most prized city, but also to flirt with and harass French women, just as these amateur Nazi photographers do. France was one of the main epicenters of prostitution in Europe, and many authors ironically describe the period between 1940 and 1945 as a golden age for the profession in France. Prostitutes expanded their businesses like never before, and more than 10,000 women had to become prostitutes to survive the horrors of war. The vast majority of their clients were the Nazis themselves, who had humiliated their army and people. However, as paid sex increased, so did the hatred and resentment of the rest of the French people towards those who offered their services to the enemy. The tragedy is that for many of the women who fell victim to German brothels in Europe, hell did not end in 1945 with the unconditional defeat of the Third Reich. Once the conflict was over, prostitutes were persecuted as traitors to their country and collaborators of the Nazi regime. In France, prostitutes were lynched, stripped naked in public, had their hair shaved close and had a swastika painted on their faces, or even had Hitler's iconic moustache painted on them. Like the mark of Cain, they were forced to march with the sign that they had slept with SS officers. Others were shaved, and so went down in history as femmes tendues, or shaven women. In these cases, they were victims of violence during and after the Second World War. Castle of Horrors: Sexual Abuse in Concentration Camps. Although concentration camps were a world apart from reality, with their own rules and horrors, the truth is that several institutions from the outside world operated within these facilities, and brothels were no exception. You might think that these spaces were reserved only for the guards and officers who watched over the camps, but there were also women destined for the most important prisoners, those who collaborated with Nazism or who organized the labor force for their fellow sufferers. The women who worked in these facilities did not do so voluntarily, but were forced and threatened. One of the first concentration camp brothels, or Lager Bordell, was established at the Mauthausen camp in 1942 to encourage prisoners' productivity. One was established at Auschwitz in June 1943 and another at Buchenwald the following month. This policy was inspired by the Soviet gulags, where the amount of work determined the food ration a prisoner received. Those who worked well and cooperated with SS officers were allowed to go there. This service was mainly used by the kapos, prisoners of a certain status within the camp, with a somewhat less hard life and more access to resources such as food and hygiene. The rest of the prisoners did not have the energy to go to these establishments. Sexual encounters in these brothels were fully supervised and planned. According to investigators, only a few traditional positions were allowed, and the act had to last a maximum of 15 minutes, not a minute longer. The horror generally occurred at night between 8 and 10 p.m., although on Sundays the shift was much longer, making it the most excruciating and painful day for the prisoners. They had to endure endless hours, receiving rapist after rapist in their chambers. The existence of the Lager Bordell gave rise to a new form of trade within the concentration camps, the exchange of coupons that could be exchanged for sexual encounters. The business was monopolized by common criminals, those who, before being arrested, were already engaged in breaking the law. A system of green triangles was used that could be exchanged for 15 minutes of sex. There is also evidence that in some cases the imprisoned women had a tattoo on their breasts with the inscription Feldhure or Camp Whore, a humiliating way of identifying them and separating them from the rest of the prison population. As we have already said, the women in the intra-prison brothels were forced to do this work and came from various concentration camps throughout Europe. For example, one of the most common was the all-female camp of Ravensbrück, where the most attractive young women were selected and, if possible, without Jewish ancestry. The SS officers devised a perverse method that aligned the prostitutes, offering them minimal benefits such as slightly higher rations or the possibility of hygiene. This generated envy and resentment in the rest of the female population of the camps, thus breaking any possibility of collaboration between the imprisoned women. Nina Mikhailovna, a concentration camp prisoner, later admitted, "When we found out that one of the girls in our block had been chosen, we would kidnap her, throw a blanket over her and beat her until she couldn't move. We didn't know if she would recover. They were just looking for better treatment and we punished them this way." It is estimated that in total some 200 women worked in these brothels under the promise of being released after 6 months, something that never happened. As if the mass rape of women was not crime enough, the Third Reich also undertook a morbid campaign of sexual re-education within the concentration camps. In addition to using the brothels to control inmates, encourage collaboration and prevent riots, Heinrich Himmler also attempted to use them as a means of introducing the pink triangle prisoners, i.e. homosexuals, to the pleasures of the opposite sex. This was conversion therapy, a sort of cure for homosexuality, something the Third Reich considered a moral degeneration typical of modernity. Historians claim that Himmler ordered all gay prisoners to make mandatory weekly visits to the camp brothels as a means of curing them of their same-sex attraction. Once the war was over, the few women who survived this torment had to endure the stigma of being field prostitutes, despite having actually been victims of the violence of the Nazi system. The vast majority of girls working in intra-prison brothels were of German origin, but had been classified by the Nazis as asocials. After the conflict ended, they were never recognized as victims or compensated accordingly. The Nazis defined asocials as, for example, homeless people, alcoholics, street musicians, prostitutes, or any woman who did not fit the ultra-conservative vision of the Nazis. Generally, they were people from very poor backgrounds. Prostitution within the concentration camps was a dark secret at least until the early 1970s, when several memoirs were published that discussed this aspect in some depth. We will always have Berlin, the use of prostitutes as Nazi spies. One of the strangest and most peculiar cases of the use of prostitution as a war policy was the Salon Kitty. It was an exclusive Berlin brothel operated by the Nazis, in which, in addition to offering sex and pleasure, a spy campaign was carried out on important figures. The place operated at number 11 on Giesebrechtstrasse, where there is a building with commercial premises that housed a hearing aid store and an interior decoration store. However, between 1930 and 1942, what was known as the largest brothel of the Third Reich operated there. The big name in this operation was Katja Emma Sophie Schmidt, alias Kitty Schmidt, a woman who operated as the Führer of the 500 square meters on the third floor of the building. Prostitutes from all over Europe worked there, mainly from countries such as Poland and Czechoslovakia. Kitty was a music teacher in her 40s who had lived in various parts of the world and had learned the secrets of the night, finding in the brothels a safe business with perpetual demand. On paper, the Nazis were against such establishments which proliferated throughout Berlin during the 1920s. Bear in mind that prior to Nazism, it is estimated that 125,000 women and 35,000 men were engaged in sexual services. The difference is that the Salon Kitty was intended to be a meeting place for foreign diplomats based in Berlin or passing through the capital, although the place was also frequented by military personnel and potential internal enemies of Adolf Hitler's regime. The rooms of the brothel were the ideal place to learn the secrets of the most important men in the city. In the privacy of the hall, where there was a grand piano, crystal chandeliers and thick carpets, it was likely that secrets would be made that could be used by the Nazi leaders to punish dissidents or to forestall decisions by friendly countries. To this end, a listening device with microphones was installed. What was said in the rooms on the third floor reached the basement, where a network of cables carried the sound to be recorded on large discs. The masterminds of the plan were two high-ranking young men in the Nazi regime. On the one hand, Reinhard Heydrich, the top security official and later co-author of the Holocaust, who had the idea, and on the other, one of the main exponents of German espionage, Walter Schellenberg, who put it into practice. Or at least this was the official version for decades, since, over time, there has been a dispute over how the Salon Kitty really worked. The truth is that there are many mysteries behind the operation of this establishment, from the true method of espionage to the frequency with which important personalities visited. One of the most reproduced stories is that of Galeazzo Ciano, Benito Mussolini's son-in-law, who went to a cinema near the brothel. Once the lights dimmed and the film began, the Italian would secretly leave to use the services of Schmidt's girls. Ciano would return minutes before the film ended, just in time to applaud and praise the performances and the plot twists. Historians are also unsure of Madame Miss Kitty's role. and it remains unclear whether the prostitute was a Nazi collaborator or was forced to collaborate based on her area of expertise. Much of what is supposedly known is often confused with another film, Salon Kitty, an exploitation film by Italian director Tinto Brass. In that film, the events were exaggerated to generate commercial appeal, so it cannot be taken as a concrete historical reference. Such was the impact of the Nazi prostitutes as spies that during the 1970s, a whole series of films were made set in the Reich's brothels and brothels. Of course, as in Tinto Brass's film, the percentage of truth was widely diluted in exaggerated and morbid fictions. The paradox is that the stories told by the real survivors of prostitution during this period recount events much more cruel and savage than those in any horror film. Prostitution, both forced and voluntary, was one of the most important phenomena during the Second World War. In the case of the Third Reich, this practice was militarized and used as a weapon of combat, both for internal control and to carry out ambitious espionage operations. The use as a tool of something that Nazi ideology considered immoral and degenerate is just one more example of the narrative inconsistency within the beliefs of National Socialism, the horror of Auschwitz, the story of Josef Mengele. But if we want to talk about the atrocities committed against women during the Third Reich, we cannot fail to mention who is probably the most sinister figure of his era. Josef Mengele was born in 1911 in Bavaria, Germany, to an upper-class family. From a young age, he stood out for his intelligence and showed a deep interest in science. Around the age of 20, he decided that he wanted to dedicate his life to medicine and the study of the human species. He was obsessed with the evolution of humanity and genetics, and was particularly interested in the idea that certain people were unfit to reproduce. Mengele was a firm believer that, in order to preserve the Aryan race, all those who suffered from physical or mental illness, or were considered racially inferior, should be eliminated. Naturally, his ideas led him to the National Socialist movement, so that after completing his university studies in medicine, he joined the Nazi Party in 1937. From then on, Mengele rose rapidly through the hierarchy of the Third Reich, helped by his family's good connections and by his supposed knowledge of the human species, which impressed many Nazi leaders. At just 27 years old, he was accepted into the SS, after an investigation confirmed that his ancestors were Aryan. In 1942, in the midst of the war, Mengele was sent to Ukraine to serve as a war doctor, and there he earned several medals for his acts of bravery on the battlefront. A year later, Mengele obtained what he had long desired, a position as an official doctor in the largest concentration camp in the Third Reich. By May 1943, as already mentioned, Auschwitz was suffering from a severe typhus epidemic. Mengele's solution was to send all those who showed even the slightest symptoms of the disease to the gas chambers, and 1,600 gypsies and Jews were executed. He then ordered the murder of 600 female prisoners in order to clear the barrack where they slept. He had the place disinfected from top to bottom, took the inmates from the next barrack to be bathed, and then sent them to the clean space. He repeated this with all the other barracks, and in this way the epidemic came to an end. The 600 victims in the first barrack had died simply because there was nowhere to put them, and not because they had typhus. The extermination center was for the Angel of Death a huge sadistic playground, as there he was able to conduct the most atrocious research in the history of science. The doctor believed that, through these cruel activities, he would be able to discover the formula to create the purest and most perfect human race of all. Josef Mengele's most infamous experiments were those he practiced on twin brothers. He ordered them to be grouped in separate barracks, where they received better food than the rest of the prisoners, so that they would maintain an adequate state of health. The hell began when the doctor brought them to his laboratory and tied them up by their hands and feet. He gave them injections with typhus to observe how each one reacted to the disease. He also performed unnecessary amputations or performed blood transfusions from one body to another. If one died, Mengele killed the surviving brother and dissected the corpses to study their organs. He was as cruel as he was methodical, and there was nothing crazy about his actions. He was the living example of what philosophers call evil with reason, the idea that a person can be absolutely terrible and completely aware of his actions. After committing the most inhuman brutalities, he returns home to have dinner with his family and play with his children, as if nothing had happened. The Pleasure of Monsters, Mengele's most sinister experiments. Dr. Mengele's most disturbing experiment was undoubtedly the time he sewed two children together back-to-back to create artificial Siamese twins. The result was tragic as the wounds became infected, and within a very short time the children died of gangrene. However, it was not unusual for the doctor's activities to end in this way. He knew that it was one of the possible risks, but he did not care about the cost in human lives, so he continued with his sinister experiments. Mengele conducted experiments to cure injuries caused by mustard gas, and to do so he applied the chemical to his patients, causing them enormous pain. Usually the doctor would worsen the injuries on purpose by introducing ground glass or wood shavings into the subjects, aggravating the injuries to test what was the maximum level of pain a person could withstand. On the other hand, the Angel of Death was always interested in genetic malformations, and for this reason he saved the Auschwitz family, a group of 7 Jewish dwarfs, from the gas chambers so that he could experiment on them. He subjected them to long sessions of X-rays, extracted their blood to the point where they fainted, and even removed their teeth to analyze their genetic material and the cause of hereditary diseases. Despite the terrible suffering they were subjected to, all the Auschwitzers survived and gave their testimony about the horrors they lived through with Mengele. In 1945, the Angel of Death's fate seemed to be running out. World War II was drawing to a close, and the Nazi Empire was on the brink of destruction. The doctor had to leave Auschwitz to avoid being captured by the Soviets. The most widely spread version of events claims that Mengele threw aside his SS uniform and fled disguised as a Wehrmacht soldier. He was caught by the Allies but was misidentified and so was released, unaware that he was the most infamous doctor of all time. The doctor traveled by sea to South America, with the intelligence services of all Western countries hot on his heels. He decided to stay in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where thanks to a network of Nazi contacts he got a job as a carpenter. Although he did not change his name, he tried not to mention his past to anyone and kept a low profile. Although most governments considered Mengele to have died under unknown circumstances, the famous Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal suspected that the Angel of Death was still alive. In 1959, the researcher found information in a public archive about Mengele's activities in Buenos Aires, so he alerted the West German authorities to have him extradited and tried. However, the doctor knew that they were out to get him, so he fled again. In 1960, he moved to Paraguay, where he settled on a farm near the Argentine border. By then, the press had published photographs of him along with stories of his experiments at Auschwitz. Cornered, Mengele escaped to Brazil, where he lived out the rest of his years under a false identity. The authorities were never able to find him. His health deteriorated steadily. In 1979, while swimming in the sea, he suffered a stroke and drowned. 6 years later, his son Rolf confessed to the authorities that the mysterious man who died in Brazil was the infamous doctor. The Chronicles of Dr. Doom, the story of Albert Heim. Aribert Heim was born on June 28, 1914, in Bad Radkersburg, Austria. He joined the Nazi Party in 1935 and graduated from the University of Vienna with a degree in medicine in 1940. During World War II, Heim volunteered to join the German Waffen-SS, eventually rising to the rank of captain. After a year, Heim was sent as a doctor to the Mauthausen concentration camp, located in the city of the same name in Austria. For context, we will mention that its facilities were divided into approximately 100 subcamps located in Germany and Austria, and Heim worked specifically at the Ebensee camp, located in the Austrian city of Linz. Mauthausen was one of the first camps created by Adolf Hitler, and it is estimated that between 120,000 and 320,000 prisoners were murdered there. Among this large number of deaths are several of the crimes of Aribert Heim, who, due to his methods, earned the nickname Dr. Death, or in his absence, the Butcher of Mauthausen. Among the painful tortures he practiced in this concentration camp, the most notable were the operations without anesthesia on prisoners who expressed any ailment. In turn, according to the account of Holocaust survivors, Heim injected his victims directly into the heart with substances such as gasoline, phenol, water, or different types of poisons. Naturally, these methods were instantly lethal. Several prisoners who also managed to survive the war mentioned that Dr. Death removed the tattooed skin of his prisoners and used it to make seat covers that he later gave to the camp commander. Added to this account is the experience lived by Marcelino Bilbao, lieutenant of the Isaac Puente Battalion of the National Confederation of Labour of the Basque Country, who survived Mauthausen. Bilbao confessed that Heim extracted his blood repeatedly over a month and a half, then injected him with a liquid that ended up paralyzing his body. On the other hand, Heim also removed the organs of his victims without any anesthesia, a method that caused the death of hundreds of people. Karl Lotter, a medical professional who worked at the Mauthausen hospital during Dr. Death's stay, gave gruesome details of a violent case that he witnessed. In his account, Lotter described how an inmate approached Heim with his swollen foot, seeking assistance. The butcher of Mauthausen did not miss the opportunity to carry out one of his macabre experiments. In this case, he decided to anesthetize the victim, but far from dealing with his foot, he began to open his body, removed one of his kidneys, and castrated him. After the patient's death, Heim cut off his head, boiled it, and stripped it of its flesh. According to Lotter's account, the butcher used his skull as a paperweight on his desk. In a sworn statement, the witness claimed to have heard Dr. Death say that he needed the head because of his perfect teeth. In February 1942, the prisoners of the Austrian concentration camp were no longer subjected to the macabre practices of Dr. Death, as he was transferred to northern Finland to serve in the 6th Mountain Division north of the SS, more precisely in hospitals in the city of Oulu. In 1945, Heim was captured by the American Army in a prisoner of war camp. He was later granted freedom and worked as a gynecologist in the German city of Baden-Baden. In 1962, after learning that the police were waiting for him at his home, Aribert Heim fled, and his whereabouts were never known for certain. According to the testimony of his son Rudiger, he crossed France, Spain, Morocco, and Libya to finally settle in Egypt. Over time, he became one of the most wanted Nazis, and the German government, together with the Mossad and entities such as the Simon Wiesenthal Center, intensified their search year after year. According to various versions, Dr. Death traveled through Spain, Denmark, and the Balkan Peninsula, and some witnesses claim to have seen him in the Uruguayan city of Paysandú and in Chilean and Argentine Patagonia. In 2005, the Spanish police wrongly reported having found him in the city of Palafrugell. The following year, a German newspaper reported that Heim had had a daughter named Waltraud, who lived on the outskirts of the city of Puerto Montt, Chile. It was she who declared that her father died in 1993. However, when she tried to collect her inheritance, she was unable to produce the death certificate. In 2009, the German broadcaster ZDF and the New York Times reported that the doctor's death took place in Cairo, Egypt, under the identity of Tarek Farid Hussein on August 10, 1992, due to cancer, and the news was taken as true by the international community, although the truth will probably never be known. From heroes to monsters, Allied sexual abuse of German women. During the last year of World War II, as the Allies closed in on the heart of the Third Reich, hundreds of thousands of cases of rape of German women were recorded. Later studies indicated that the vast majority of these crimes were committed by Soviet troops, although there are records of American, British, and French soldiers taking part in such abuse. These cases were generally hushed up and remained an open secret for most of the 20th century. According to historian Antony Beevor, whose books were banned in 2015 from some Russian schools and universities, the NKVD, the Soviet Union's secret police, was aware of the rape incidents but did little to prevent the soldiers' behavior. It was usually the rear units that committed the most crimes against German women. These actions were seen as an act of patriotism and encouraged through propaganda. Soviet writer Ilya Ehrenberg wrote to soldiers, "Use force and break the racial pride of German women. Take them as your just spoils of war." The exact number of German women who suffered some form of abuse at the hands of Soviet soldiers is unknown, but some sources estimate the figure to be in the hundreds of thousands. Other, more pessimistic sources put the number closer to 2 million. During World War II, the first records of sexual assaults within German territory date back to 21 October 1944, when Red Army troops crossed the Angrapa River on the border between Germany and Poland. That same day, the Soviets carried out of the present. The testimonies of people who lived through that terrible time are also of great value. One of the most valuable is the diary of the young Ukrainian Lieutenant Vladimir Gelfand, who was among the Soviet troops surrounding the German capital in 1945. One of the most striking passages was written on April 25th. The lieutenant was walking along the Spree River when he came across a group of German women carrying suitcases and old clothes. In shaky German, he asked them why they were fleeing their homes. In tears, the women replied that at least 20 Russian soldiers had attacked them the night before and had taken turns abusing them. But sexual violence was not the monopoly of the Red Army. American soldiers were guilty of similarly terrible crimes, albeit on a smaller scale. Author J. Robert Lilly claims that cases of rape by American soldiers amounted to 11,040. The most brutal cases occurred during the American occupation of France after the Normandy landings. Many of the American attacks in Germany were gang-raped and carried out at gunpoint, adding a sadistic flavor to their crime. The U.S. Army established laws against fraternization between soldiers and German women, but within the force the phrase "copulation without conversation is not fraternization" became popular, an ironic way of referring to sexual assaults. Osmar White was an Australian correspondent who accompanied American troops during the war. In his texts, he describes how each case was handled depending on the unit. In some cases, the aggressor was identified, tried by court-martial, and punished. The most brutal and sadistic cases received the maximum penalty of execution. The problem is that most of the trials were against African American soldiers. I know very well that many of the attacks were carried out by white soldiers. In those cases, there were no consequences. Among countries with soldiers guilty of sexual crimes, the United Kingdom appears to have been the most active in conducting military trials. The British military police investigated cases, and if serious, a court-martial was carried out. The only problem was that drunkenness and post-traumatic stress disorder were considered viable excuses to reduce the rapist's sentence. So many British attackers received minimal reprimands. A particularly aberrant case is that of the French soldiers, who committed crimes quite similar to those of the Red Army. There are official documents that record the number of rapes in the various German towns. The figures range from 300 to 600 cases per region, but the chilling fact is that in these places there were only a few thousand women living there. So a huge percentage of the female population was the victim of these attacks. As within the US Army, the blame was mainly placed on soldiers of Moroccan origin or from one of the French colonies. According to historical studies, it is estimated that a total of 1,500 children were born as a result of rapes carried out by French soldiers. Although the son of a soldier was considered a citizen of France, in general the parents did not take responsibility, and the children became part of the smoking ruins of German cities. One of the main obstacles to studying these crimes is that for years they were silenced and the testimonies dismissed, as they came from German women who were believed to be former militants of the Nazi Party. There was a notion that, since the Third Reich had committed some of the most abhorrent crimes in history, any kind of revenge on its people was valid. In post-war Germany, especially in West Germany, the stories of these sexual abuses gradually became a central point in the historical debate, generating the most varied opinions. Thank you so much for following us to the end. If you liked our content, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. See you next time.